Last June 21st, on Indigenous Solidarity Day, the federal government introduced Bill C53, an act respecting the recognition of certain Métis governments in Alberta, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. C-53 has passed second reading. Third reading is expected soon after the current round of committee meetings wraps up. For more on this, we turn to our Truth and Politics panel. Carrie Benjo is editor of Eagle Feather News in Regina, and Egon Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. We spoke yesterday. Carrie and Egon, thanks for being with us again this week. Egon, Bill C53 appeared out of nowhere. It's almost ready for third reading. Can you give us a bit of a rundown, I guess, of what's in it?
It did come out of nowhere, perhaps, I think, for certain segments of the political communities in Canada. But I mean, certainly for a long time, the Liberals have been trying to court what they see as Métis peoples. They've had a long-standing relationship with the Red River Métis in Manitoba. And so it perhaps comes as no surprise they see a constituency amongst other Métis communities, some which are seen by the Red River Métis as legitimate and other ones in Ontario which are considered illegitimate. The problem with this bill, of course, is that it really recognizes Section 35 rights or constitutional rights for Métis communities which are under discussion, under debate, and are seen as illegitimate by many people who are the actual Métis Nation here in Manitoba. And so by recognizing that those communities in Ontario, which Ontario recognizes, the Métis National Council recognizes, which includes kind of the stalwarts of in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and of course MNC President Cassidy Caron, it is giving rights to those Métis peoples, or those peoples who are calling themselves Métis, who are using the symbols of the Red River Métis and don't have any historical claim to that nation. And so it's become a real mess. And as members for the Manitoba Métis Federation says, it's actually backwards, because it recognizes that any treaties that are created either have been signed, and there's an agreement, self-government agreements that signed last February, or those agreed in the future will be therefore with people who are not actually Métis.
Carrie, why do you think the Liberals introduced this bill in the first place?
Well, like Egon had mentioned, this is something that has been in the works. And I think that, you know, in their term and this movement towards reconciliation, this was just one of the areas that they wanted to address. And it may have appeared to have come out of nowhere, but I think there has been a lot of groundwork in place. And I think for a lot of us within the First Nations community, we have been disconnected from what is happening among the Métis, which is, I think, on us for not keeping in touch and keeping those lines of communication and understanding what the Métis people are experiencing, because we do have a shared history. And I think this disconnect is feeding some of the problems that we're seeing today.
Egon, you mentioned the Manitoba Métis Federation. They're not part of this legislation. They're working on their own modern-day treaty that they hope is passed before the end of the year. What are the differences in the two deals?
It can be very complicated, I think, for people who are not involved in the politics and the conversations that are happening in the Métis Nation of that Métis National Council, of which the Manitoba Métis Federation was a founding member, and have now separated over this issue of Métis communities in Ontario, who the MMF claim have no historical claim about being Métis, and genealogically certainly have no connection. If anything, they are mixed blood people who descend from First Nations in Ontario and may now have their own identity, but you wouldn't see so according to the images that they use or the stories that you use, which are all from Manitoba. They are not talking about even their own territories, and so it's highly problematic. And that by this bill coming in, it's saying that Métis people are the same across the prairies and into Ontario, which they simply are not. And so that's where it really gets into stepping into, which are two issues. One is, it is the federal government declaring and recognizing those who are Métis when many Métis don't recognize, even those within the Métis Nation of Alberta and Saskatchewan don't recognize those within Ontario as being Métis or having historical connections. And the second is, this is really a First Nations rights issue, because when you recognize people in Ontario as having Section 35 claims, constitutional claims as Indians, Indigenous peoples within the country, what you're saying is that that is then in the same category as First Nations rights, and naturally that will impede on those First Nations in Ontario. And so what this is really paternalistic. It is highly colonial for a government to make the determination in what really should be a conversation between Métis peoples or people who claim to be Métis about ultimately what does it mean to be part of a national Métis nation. And frankly, I think the Red River Métis have the strongest claim and the right to be able to have be a leader in that discussion. Separate bills is not going to be the way in which we bring people together for this conversation.
Kerry, as Niigaan said, First Nations really from coast to coast have raised concerns about this bill, particularly when it comes to the Métis Nation of Ontario. Do you think there's any chance we might see this bill not pass, not receive royal assent?
There has been a lot of discussion, a lot of pushback from First Nations in regards to the bill, but it's making its way through. It remains to be seen whether or not it's their protests against it will make a difference, but I think they have very legitimate concerns, because when we're talking about this, there's this it's about citizenship. But in reality, if we're recognizing people that don't have a connection to the land, Indigenous people within the Métis province of the Ontario, they are concerned about, whether or not this group that doesn't have a traditional connection to the land will suddenly be the ones, deciding the future of land use. And I think that's a big issue, because when we talk about duty to consult, they should be talking to people that have that historic traditional connection to the land, because that affects them and their future generations, not people that don't have that history, and I think that's what a lot of First Nations chiefs have brought up, is that, although it's talking about citizenship and membership and things like that, ultimately it's about land. And so that's an issue that is of a concern, not only to Indigenous people, First Nations people within Ontario, but all across Canada.
Kerry, Niigaan, big topic, hard to discuss even within 7 minutes, but appreciate you taking the time to do so today.
Miigwech, please.